All right, well, I do want to talk for a minute a little bit about Stuxnet and how Stuxnet goes from 2012 when this thing was first discovered all the way to today and what the journey looks like, and frankly to acknowledge a kind of attack vector that bad guys, starting with some nation states, including likely ours, certainly mine, put together an attack vector that's become a pretty common blueprint for bad guys to take advantage of. And I want to talk at length about what that looks like. As a quick photo, how many of you are familiar with what is displayed in this photograph? A couple of you. What is this? That's right. This is the fully air-gapped underground nuclear facility in Iran, where the Iranian scientists were working to refine uranium in order to weaponize and make a nuclear bomb. The reason this is important is, of course, this is the attack vector that's now known as Stuxnet. And Stuxnet is quite interesting. How many of you done any serious academic or info security research on Stuxnet? Okay, well, good. You can correct me when I might veer slightly, but I'll tell you an interesting story. If you look at the Stuxnet attack, effectively what happened, among other things, was that a piece of malware was signed and sat inside this air-gapped nuclear facility underground for 18 months undetected. A piece of malicious code that was meant to disrupt these SCADA systems and actually speed up the centrifuge which created the uranium or refined the uranium milliseconds, these Siemens SCADA systems. That little piece of malware, that known bad code, sat undetected for 18 months. How? Ultimately, the answer is pretty short. They had leveraged 2 stolen digital certificates, X509 certificates, to sign the malware. And the malware sat undetected until the bad guys, in this case, the US government, the Israeli government, and most likely the UK government, all worked together to turn on the malware, deploy the malware, and make it speed up these reactors, to the point where ultimately the result was fairly catastrophic. There were 200,000 systems in the Iranian nuclear facility that were affected. 1,000 of them actually experienced a physical degradation to hardware. Can you imagine? To the point where a couple of these reactors actually blew up, and it's likely that some folks, including some well-educated scientists, lost their lives. What does that mean? I mean, what kind of a blueprint for an attack could that mean if you can actually take over trust, the digital trust that the PKI provides, and use that against any organization? Now, the reality is when I started in this business 15 years ago, and I've got a bunch of my team members, including Ian, we were together back in the day doing this. Back in the day, candidly, when I would meet with a CIO, there was rarely a CIO 15 years ago who could spell PKI, let alone understood ultimately that PKI is a security instrument and therefore has a life cycle that is meant to expire. Why? Not to make the lives of the operators, IT operators, more difficult, but ultimately to better protect your organizations. And so if this has become a kind of known attack vector that bad guys, common cyber criminals are now deploying today, what are you doing to prevent it, to remediate the known likely attack surface? I remember, and actually the last company I worked for was an Andreessen Horowitz company, a large venture capital firm based in Palo Alto. And the founder there, Mark Andreessen, who you may have heard, is the guy who coined this expression 20 years ago, that eventually software will eat the world. Have you heard that before? What does that mean? I mean, we live in the app age, right? Our company name, AppView, is meant to give you the visibility into these applications and how they're being used and how, in many cases, they're actually being weaponized. Now, what does this mean in terms of digital transformation? Certainly, I heard the CEO of Palo Alto Networks, everybody knows Palo Alto, spoke at a small group that we're part of, and he actually acknowledged that JP Morgan Chase has more software engineers today than VMware. Can you imagine that? Banks are software development firms, right? Their job is to deploy software and get it out to their customers more quickly. If the attack vector is such that every bad guy, every cyber criminal from nation states all the way down to common cyber criminals are using this attack vector, right? If you can gain the trust in a zero trust framework and look like you're an authenticated individual or piece of code, what does that give? What does that provide for you? I mean, the opportunities are tremendous because this is not a one-to-many. This is a many-to-many instance where these certificates are the lifeblood of authenticating and data secrecy between systems, between applications, between hardware, between software, et cetera. And the reality is all of these systems, all these applications, all of these pieces of hardware, including out at the edge, have identities. And who the hell has a handle on these identities? Right? We've got carbon-based life forms and we've got silicon-based life forms. We've spent a lot of money as an industry thinking about the identity and access management of the human-based life form. The reality is, I think we need to do a better job of identifying and acknowledging that we have very little visibility today into the identities of these applications and machines, right? Now, a statement that I think was very, very profound that Gartner made, a guy named Neil McDonald made this statement where he acknowledged digital certificates can no longer be blindly trusted. Interestingly, this statement was made in 2012. It's a very interesting, almost prophetic piece of counsel in a piece of research called Living in a World Without Trust. And it anticipated what would happen from a global supply chain attack vector. Now, if you think just back in recent years, there are a number of fairly well-known attacks that were specifically focused on supply chains. Why? Because you may have a weakest link in your supply chain. You think you've got good defense in depth, but the reality is the perimeter is gone. The perimeter today is absolutely, has to be focused on identities. Identity is the new perimeter. So how are you getting an identity, excuse me, a handle on your digital identities if you don't know where they are, if you don't know what governs them, if you don't know the life cycle that governs them, et cetera. And then you fast forward to very recently, right? I assume you're all aware, the SolarWinds attack, a very devastating attack that affected many organizations, including the US government. Among the three primary vectors now published by Microsoft, the third, and a significant one, was escalated privileges via taking over SSL certificates, X509 PKI certificates. Right, so again, code signing. So the attack vector, the blueprint that was created back in 2008, we think, for Stuxnet, is now being used all the way today and weaponized again in a global attack in a supply chain. If certificates can no longer be blindly trusted, and we live in this world that's all about the app-centric world, right, and you have more and more of these applications, devices, hardware, and software systems, all of which are governed by or have trust via certificates, what are you doing to ensure you know where they are, let alone how they are being managed and authenticated? Now, the reason this is interesting is because if you think about a certificate, and frankly, our business as an organization has largely come for the past 10 years for two reasons. Most of which is because organizations have lots of certificates deployed. They don't know where they are. They don't know what policies govern them. They don't know what key links are in place. They don't know who the issuers are. And yet, when one expires, everybody runs around with their heads cut off. Right? That's a serious visibility problem, and it's probably a symptom of a much bigger problem. If you have a certificate that expires, that means you don't know about it. Right? If you don't know about it, that's an operational disadvantage, but it's also a fairly significant security vulnerability. So the question is, how do you increase your visibility into these certificates, which of course increasingly are shorter and shorter in their life cycle by design? The certificate life cycle was once 20 years. We actually used to work and talk with people who would acknowledge, yep, I've got a self-signed certificate on a printer over here that's a 20-year life certificate, and I will be retired by the time it expires, so it's someone else's problem. Someone else gets to inherit that baggage. Now that's a reality. We actually have customers, and I'm meeting with a bunch of customers this week, Lloyd's, Barclays, Rabobank, Shell, all large customers leveraging our software capabilities really to govern not only the issuance, but the governance of these certificates. I'll tell you candidly, I think it's interesting where many years ago, maybe even 10 years ago, VeriSign, right, they were a cash cow, printing certificates, EV certificates at high cost. That world is gone, right? The cloud providers have disrupted that market entirely, where it's not about issuance anymore. Issuance is fairly easy. You can get issuance via any of the cloud providers, and frankly, there's enough open source freeware, including Let's Encrypt certificates, where certificate issuance is not a costly endeavor. But with the ubiquity of PKI comes this problem of you've got PKI, you've got certificates throughout the organization, and you just imagine what's going to happen as you go to a on-prem, hybrid, multi-cloud, DevOps, and edge world. Does the number of certificates decrease or increase, do you think? Sorry, it's almost lunch, so I can ask some dumb questions and hopefully get a little bit of a chuckle. The reality is the certificate lifecycle is intentionally, as these are security instruments, becoming shorter and shorter. Ephemeral certificates is a good thing from a security practice point of view, but a dangerous thing from an operations point of view. Let's assume you might have, depending on the size of your organization, and most of our customers, including the medium to large and very large enterprise, have sometimes 10,000, sometimes hundreds of thousands. We have a large customer in the US, Dexcom, who have a couple 100,000, and it will soon be millions of certificates. How do you do that via a spreadsheet, team? Right? That's the common practice today. Now, all the certificate authority vendors, the issuers will tell you they've got a management capability, but ultimately what they're interested in doing is discovering their competitor certificates to replace them with their own certificates, which of course violates every best practice when it comes to CA crypto agility. What happens in case of a certificate authority issuing event? You've got to quickly be able to move from one to the other, just as they tried to do at SolarWinds. How do you want to be negotiating with a vendor at that point, right? They hold all the cards, all the chips, they win. All right, now we did some research. We engaged Larry Ponemon. Some of you may know Dr. Ponemon, he's been around a long time. And we published a piece of research earlier this year. It says January, it should be February. We talked to 1,500 IT security practitioners and auditors, frankly, your peers, perhaps even some of you. And the majority of them came from medium to large enterprises across a couple of different continents, right, including the UK. And what we found was what we already knew, and that is largely that organizations don't know what they have. Talk about an unquantified, unmitigated risk. Right, this is why I asked that question at the beginning. What do you spend on your human identity and access management policies? You should be spending at least that much, if not more, given that the number of certificates, these digital identities, is likely 10x. I just read a report last week from CyberArk that acknowledged the relationship between humans and certificates is likely 40 to 1. So for every one human on the planet, there will likely be 40 certificates. And I think that's, frankly, a little conservative. Just on my watch here, my tablet, my phone, and my laptop, I've got about 80 right here. And that doesn't include anything at my house in terms of smart IoT technology, nor at the rest of my organization in terms of server-side capabilities, edge capabilities, and DevOps environments. Ultimately, right, meant to make us think a little bit, what are we doing to ensure if there is a kind of proven attack vector that seems to be fairly common, has become a kind of blueprint, what are we doing? Certainly seeing some nodding heads. Part of the research indicated that everyone acknowledges, and I think this is, because it's self-responded, I think the number would be low, but 61% of those we surveyed acknowledged that, yeah, they don't have full visibility, they don't have perfect visibility into where their certificate and keys are. If these are, as we often call them, the keys to the kingdom, Tim Cook called them the God key, right, the encryption key. If you have them and they're everywhere and you don't know about them, how are you possibly managing them? How are you possibly keeping the right governance, the right policies in place? Ultimately, our view is this is a pretty interesting problem, and while the operational side is pretty much what drives the majority of our business today, I think you'll quickly see a time in which you think about the security landscape changing, where organizations realize we've got to do a better job from identity and access management point of view of getting a handle on these pesky little things. Now, listen, I'm as skeptical as anyone about industry pundits. There are lots of them out there, including Gartner. If you look at the history of Gartner, frankly, they've had a pretty poor track record of predicting market movements. But what they're very good at is talking to you, their enterprise customers, and then distilling that information, having spoken to hundreds, if not thousands, of global enterprises and listening, what are the key problems? Right? We certainly talk about what it takes to digitally transform an organization, which is at least two things, I think. It's about getting to a state of increased cloud usage, likely a hybrid cloud, so you don't have all your eggs in one basket, and an increase in automation. Right? If you disagree, I'd love to talk to you afterwards. But at least as I talk to CIOs and CISOs, generally, those are the two things they're looking to do. Deploy more cloud, get to a hybrid state. Interestingly, I read a report recently about repatriation. Lots of organizations are acknowledging you can't put everything in the cloud. You do have to have some things on-prem, so it really becomes this magic art of hybrid multi-cloud capability. How do you do that when you've got then likely thousands, if not tens of thousands, of these machine identities out there that nobody seems to know about? Now, in terms of a top trend, this is where Gartner always gets it right, because they're talking to you, their biggest customers, and they've said last year, of the top 10 trends, this new thing they're calling machine identity management, fairly clever messaging, by the way, because it ties to the existing market called identity and access management. If there is this thing called machine identities, what are the practices that help regulate and govern those machine identities? Well, at least according to Gartner, in 2021 last year, they acknowledged this was a top 5 trend. What does that mean? It means organizations are finding a way to make budget allocations to solve this problem in increasing ways. So you ought to be looking at your own budgeting framework for the next fiscal year and asking, where is our line item for managing these pesky identities, this new form of identity? And the reality is Gartner just published their newest version of this report, came out 3 weeks ago, and they've now put this as the number 2 item. They slightly morphed it. It's now more about machine identity, less about the management piece. So I think, just to get into some of the technical weeds of how to solve this problem, you clearly have to have better visibility. So a robust next-gen discovery engine that goes out and does a scanning capability, and there are several of these available. Qualys has a very good free scanning capability to give you insight into your digital identity population. Once you understand then and are able to import it into some system, how do you monitor, how do you manage, and preferably how do you automate? Ultimately, we got in this business years ago because we saw automation as being the key to solving this problem. There's no way from a sustainability to have the dozens, perhaps even hundreds of smart engineers capable, and in this case, well-paid engineers, to manage your certificates manually. I often joke it is first called the Great Resignation, then it was called the Great Reshuffle. Now it's really the Great Renegotiation. Can't tell you what the impact in terms of salaries is. I was talking to someone at lunch, just jump across the street, go from one bank to the other, and you get a 20% salary increase. We live in an interesting world. The reality is increasing amounts of the digital footprint exist and are being protected by these new kinds of identities. Now, I certainly think you've got to have the kind of holistic view deep into the estate. What does that population of certificates and encryption keys look like? I hope no one in the room would disagree when I say that cryptography is now critical infrastructure. You can't do digital transformation without it. I would actually argue the foundation of all IT is DNS and crypto. Right? On top of those two things, every other system, including all other zero trust framework platforms, exist. If you don't have your keys and certificates and your DNS properly managed, governed in the right framework with the right visibility, nothing else matters because you can bypass all the other systems via these loopholes. And then, I mentioned this earlier, the need to have a kind of crypto agile state. Gartner's been talking about this for 10 years. NIST has published 3 different guidelines. The US National Institute of Standards and Technology, 3 different guidelines on what it means to be crypto agile. This is no longer a theoretical risk, right? 2 public certificate authorities, the issuers of trust, have been compromised. What do you do when you're using one of those publicly trusted CAs and the root of your trust is signed back to them and they get compromised? What do you do then? Do you want to be on the phone negotiating a better price discount with a competitor at that point? No. You need to have multiple CAs working simultaneously. You might have perhaps your Microsoft CA for internal. You might be using some DigiCert or some Sectigo. There's lots of providers out there today. We ultimately want to be in the business of being that kind of neutral Switzerland approach. We don't care what you have in a multi-hybrid world. We just want to be able to provide the visibility, the governance, and then, of course, the automation. And we were just talking with our moderator about this kind of slide, right? We know that the world is changing. DevOps is taking over. Traditional IT is gone, right? We all ultimately are working for the app developers. The app developers run the world, and they want to get stuff out fast, right? They do not care about security, generally speaking. When I look at this and moved from your right to left, ultimately, a lot of our business comes from the operational challenge of having the right visibility and then being able to understand when a certificate's about to expire, and then what action do you take? I think the reality is, though, as we become more mature as enterprises in our DevOps environments, we're starting to think more about the security landscape as well as the development landscape. At that point, you have to have much better visibility, and it's not just your X509 PKI certificates, it's also SSH. I talked with a customer a couple of years back at a world-class UK-based top 3 bank who acknowledged they had a secure shell key that the administrator had deployed 8 years earlier, and the administrator had been gone from the bank for 7 years. Still had access, still had root privilege access as a non-employee. How is this possible, right? Secure shell doesn't expire. Those rights, that escalated privilege access goes on indefinitely until the key is revoked or replaced. It's worth leaving this conference thinking about what does my security vulnerability posture look like if I don't have better governance, better visibility into the digital assets and these machine identities that are becoming really the foundational component of all IT infrastructure and, of course, most common cyber attacks today. Having that ability to understand where these are, how they're deployed, what governs them is critically important. Now, just to end on a little bit of a pitch to give you some perspective, by show of hands, how many of you have heard of AppView before? Yeah. This is where we've got to do a little bit of marketing, clearly. I think I counted 2 hands, not including members of the UK-based AppView team here. If we had had their hands, the number would have gone up by an order of magnitude to something like 6 versus 2. We've got to work on that, clearly. Just to give you some perspective, and we've got some of the largest customers in the world. We've got a customer I met with 2 weeks ago in Phoenix. Probably heard of this company, American Express. They deploy 348,000 workflows in AppView, have all 3 of our products deployed inside their environment. Right? This is all about automation. This is about leveraging an automation platform to reduce the known human errors, right? Good people who make mistakes, in order to reduce your security risk and improve your security posture and the uptime and availability of your systems. Now, just to wrap with a slide that acknowledges where we are in the world today. This is not a new topic. I worked at a couple of companies that helped to create this space, right? Lots of money has gone into, from a venture capital and private equity point of view, to educate the world on the problem. I'm perhaps doing some of that today with this audience. I think we need to acknowledge that many of you, and I won't ask you to raise your hands, are doing this via manual process, a spreadsheet. You might have a couple thousand rows, each of which tracks or at least attempts to track your certificate population, up to perhaps tens of thousands. I would simply argue that's an untenable position, especially as the world increases and the number of certificates that get deployed increases. Our view is you certainly have some vendors out there who do a decent job of what I would call discovery and monitoring. This is way more than just the need for monitoring your systems and your certificates. You really need lights out automation. And if you can get a next-gen microservices oriented with a built-in zero trust model and a service mesh, it should make life much easier. Right? That's the business we're in. Well-funded, just did a Series B, have about $50 million in total investment in order to help your peers, the largest organizations in the world, solve this problem. And the last little advanced slide acknowledges that we now have a no-risk SaaS trial offer. You'd literally go out, sign up for it, download it to run it from your laptop, and you can point it at your system or systems, and very quickly, within minutes, maybe even depending on the size of the environment, hours, get a much better visibility into what the infrastructure looks like, what your environment looks like, what the population of your keys and certificates are, and then some base level remediation capabilities in terms of policies.